Welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep the lights on. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can pay their living expenses and continue creating these adventures for you. You can help by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description and pinned comment below. They called themselves the Apex, the Ethelgard. They did not conquer with bullets or bombs. They conquered with a leash. A biological tether they named the Ethereum network. It spanned 10,000 worlds, bleeding them dry one heartbeat at a time. The tithe was simple. Give them your life energy or give up your right to exist. Then, they brought the leash to Earth. Space is not glamorous. It is a freezing, empty graveyard. Freddie Butcher knew this better than anyone. He was a salvage operator, a cosmic trash collector, scraping a meager living off the icy, dead rocks of the Oort cloud. Dust coated his lungs permanently. Black grease stained his calloused hands. His bank account was a cruel joke. He spent his days calculating how to pay off his oxygen supplier, his fuel debts, and the mounting late fees on his rusting bucket of a ship. He worried about credits. He worried about breathing tomorrow. The grand, sweeping politics of the galaxy meant absolutely nothing to a man who had to count every single breath he took in the dark. Then the sky turned gold. The Ethelgard fleet dropped out of warp directly above Earth. They were massive, terrifyingly perfect, grotesque in their absolute, flawless beauty. Ships that looked like golden leviathans, grown from some alien flesh and polished metal, blocking out the sun entirely. Their perfection was a direct, calculated insult to the dirt, disease, and grime of humanity. They cast a cold, radiant shadow over the blue planet. The message they broadcasted on every frequency was not a negotiation. It was an eviction notice. Join the Ethereum network. Bleed your life force into their endless hunger, or be erased from the cosmos without a trace. Down on the surface, the politicians panicked. Earth leadership scrambled like blind insects trapped under a heavy boot. They aimed nuclear warheads and laser batteries at the golden sky. They fired everything they had in a desperate display of force. The Golden Fleet did not even bother to deploy energy shields. The human weapons struck their biological hulls and simply dissolved into harmless light. The Ethelgard armor absorbed the kinetic and thermal energy, as if it were a warm summer breeze. Complete, undeniable invulnerability. That realization broke the back of human pride in less than 2 hours. The global council chambers devolved into a screaming match of cowards. Pride gave way to pure terror. Terror gave way to pathetic submission. The voting process for unconditional surrender began immediately. The leaders of Earth were ready to put the biological collar on billions of human necks just to buy themselves a few more years of miserable, drained existence. Freddie did not care about the council. He did not care about the Golden Fleet casting shadows over a planet he had not visited in 5 long years. He cared that his rusted radar had just pinged a massive anomaly at the very edge of the solar system. Salvage meant credits. Credits meant oxygen. It was that simple. His winch groaned violently. The hydraulic cables screamed under the immense, crushing stress. Slowly, agonizingly, his rig dragged the heavy anomaly out of the dark void and into his pressurized cargo bay. It was a chunk of black ice. Massive. Colder than the vacuum outside. The sheer drop in ambient temperature frosted the interior metal walls of his ship instantly. But it was not just frozen water. Freddie wiped the thick grime off his helmet visor and stared. Trapped deep inside the frozen block was an entity. It was not human. It definitely was not a golden, polished leviathan of the Ethelgard. It was something much, much older. A jagged, biomechanical corpse that looked like it had been violently torn from the engine room of a machine the size of a planet. It hummed, a deep, silent vibration that rattled through the metal floor plates of his ship and traveled right up his heavy magnetic boots. "Looks like you owe the universe a debt too, ugly," Freddy muttered to the ice, grabbing his heavy tools. He hoisted his industrial plasma cutter. He dragged a heavy kinetic wrench across the floor. Crude tools meant for a crude man trying to carve out a living in the dark. He adjusted his welding mask and went to work on the black ice. Hot sparks showered the dim cargo bay, bouncing off his stained boots. The ice hissed loudly, fighting the fierce heat, fighting his stubborn will. He dug deeper into the ancient frost. The entity inside began to react to the thermal shock. It was not dead. It was merely waiting. His plasma cutter suddenly struck a metallic nerve cluster near the center of the dark mass. A violent pulse of raw, kinetic energy threw Freddy backward through the air. He slammed hard against the steel bulkhead, his breath leaving him in a sharp gasp. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air back into his bruised lungs. The cargo bay lights flickered wildly and died. Emergency red strobes snapped on, bathing the freezing room in a bloody, rhythmic glow. Then he heard it. He did not hear it with his ears. He felt it deep inside his chest. A frequency, a rhythmic, ancient pulse broadcasting directly from the alien machine. Thump, thump, thump. Freddy pressed a greasy glove against his own ribs. His heart was beating, but it was no longer setting its own pace. His heart was matching the exact rhythm of the dead machine. The entity was singing a heavy, undeniable song older than the stars themselves. And Freddy Butcher was the only human alive listening to it. The red strobe lights continued their frantic dance across the melting ice. The black frost dissolved into foul-smelling vapor, revealing the metallic heart of the entity. It did not have a face. It had a core of shifting quantum light. And as Freddy stared into it, his brain violently translated the light into raw data. The voice echoing in his skull was devoid of emotion, yet incredibly heavy with the weight of millions of years. It identified itself as a seed of truth. It was a leftover fragment, a dying echo of the real architects who had built the framework of the universe before time even had a proper name. The vision forced into Freddy's mind was clear and terrifying. The grand, perfect Ethelgard were a massive, cosmic lie. They were not the apex. They were parasites, microscopic fleas that had latched onto the rotting corpse of a dying god. They had stumbled upon the administrative keys to the Ethereum network, a tool originally meant for creation, and corrupted it. They rewrote galactic history to crown themselves kings. They did not create the biological leash. They merely found it, weaponized it, and wrapped it around the throats of 10,000 worlds to feed their own immortality. The quantum core pulsed brighter, scanning the biological makeup of the grease-stained mechanic standing before it. The next revelation hit Freddy like a physical blow to the chest. The human genome was famously a mess, a chaotic spiral of junk sequences that Earth scientists had puzzled over for centuries. The seed revealed the brutal reality of that code. That junk sequence was not genetic trash. It was a quantum blank space, a deliberate, engineered gap. When the true creators were facing their own sudden extinction, they seeded this primitive antivirus code into the primordial soup of a distant blue planet. That genetic firewall meant humans were the absolutely unique anomaly of the cosmos. They were the only species in the known universe completely immune to the automatic energy drain of the Ethereum network. The parasites could not just flip a switch and harvest Earth. If the Ethereum tether tried to latch onto human DNA, it would hit a zero-value return and fail. To bypass the blank space in the human code, the submission had to be entirely voluntary. The Golden Fleet in the sky was not offering a choice out of mercy or diplomatic grace. They were terrified. They needed humanity to agree to the terms, to willingly open the door from the inside, or the leash would simply slip off their necks. Freddy barely had time to process the magnitude of this genetic inheritance before the proximity alarms of his rusted ship screamed into life. The raw quantum transmission between his mind and the seed had spiked violently across the spectrum, painting a massive target on his salvage rig. The Golden Fleet had felt the disturbance. A heavy, biological drop pod tore through the vacuum of the Oort cloud and slammed into the outer hull of his cargo bay with a deafening crash. The metal bulkheads groaned and buckled inward, tearing the ship's outer skin. 3 biomechanical guards spilled into the freezing, depressurized bay. They were towering nightmares of hardened white chitin and pulsing purple muscle fibers, clutching kinetic weapons that hummed with dark, destructive energy. Freddy did not have a blaster. He had a brain wired for brutal survival and a space station built entirely of unstable scrap. The intruders moved with lethal, calculated grace, but they did not know the layout of a junker ship. "My ship, my rules," Freddy grunted, slamming his heavy fist onto the manual override panel next to the airlock console. He activated the heavy magnetic crane directly above the first guard, dropping a 10-ton block of compressed engine slag squarely onto its chitinous skull. The creature flattened into a spray of clear, viscous fluid and shattered armor. The remaining 2 guards shrieked, lunging forward with blinding speed. Freddy grabbed his industrial plasma cutter, dialed the heat to maximum output, and sliced straight through the main pressurized liquid nitrogen coolant line running along the lower wall. A massive cloud of sub-zero gas erupted outward, instantly flash-freezing the exposed biological joints of the alien guards. They froze mid-step, their weapons locking up, before their internal heaters could thaw the ice. Freddy swung his heavy kinetic wrench with every ounce of strength in his tired body, shattering their frozen torsos into 1,000 jagged pieces that scattered across the grated floor. He stood over the shattered remains, his chest heaving, the adrenaline burning like battery acid in his veins. He kicked aside the frozen chunks of white armor until he found what he desperately needed: the neural communication relay. It was a grotesque, squishy implant housed at the base of the guard's severed spinal cord. It pulsed weakly, with a faint, purple light, trying blindly to reconnect with the mother fleet. Freddy tore it loose with his bare, grease-stained hands. He rushed to his command console, tearing open the wiring panel of his ship's ancient analog radio array. He sliced the alien neural tissue open and spliced it directly into the copper wiring, wrapping it tightly with thick electrical tape. It was a blasphemous, ugly union of primordial alien biology and cheap human electronics. He turned back to the seat of truth. He did not ask for permission. He routed his ship's main power grid straight through the quantum core of the seed, using the ancient machine as a brute force decryption filter. The cracked screens on his console flared with impossible alien mathematics, rapidly collapsing into human binary code, and finally stabilizing into a clear, open audio channel. He had successfully bypassed the impenetrable diplomatic firewall of the Ethelgard. He was sitting directly inside the encrypted command frequency of the Golden Fleet, millions of miles away, completely unaware of the bloody struggle in the dark vacuum of space. The leaders of Earth were breaking under the pressure. Inside the grand, sterile halls of the Global Council, the atmosphere was thick with cowardice and heavy despair. The 17-hour deadline was rapidly approaching its end. The beautifully crafted, utterly pathetic message of unconditional surrender had been drafted, legally verified, and translated into the universal frequency. The Secretary General of the planet placed a trembling, sweating finger over the primary transmission console. They genuinely believed they were saving humanity from total annihilation, completely blind to the fact that they were about to willingly hand the keys of the universe over to a race of desperate cosmic leeches. The giant digital countdown timer on the wall read exactly 5 minutes. The final, ragged breath of human freedom was about to be exhaled into the dark. The Secretary General pressed the heavy glass button, sealing the fate of the planet. The digital transmission shot upward from Geneva, racing toward the orbital communication relays. It was a breathtaking masterpiece of political groveling, a document spanning exactly 412 pages of highly complex legal jargon, essentially translating to a very polite offering of human cattle. The diplomats had spent the last 16 hours wrapping their absolute cowardice in soft, palatable words like mutual cooperation, progressive assimilation, and galactic integration. They bargained away the souls of their children just to ensure they could keep their comfortable chairs in the new regime. The signal beamed toward the Golden Fleet hanging ominously in the sky, carrying the collective, voluntary surrender of 8 billion beating hearts. Inside the grand halls, the politicians exhaled a collective sigh of pathetic relief. Men and women in expensive suits congratulated themselves, shaking trembling hands, genuinely believing they had secured a peaceful enslavement. They had opened the door for the wolves and called it diplomacy. Billions of miles out in the freezing dark of the Oort cloud, Freddie Butcher wiped a fresh smear of blood and black grease from his unshaven chin. His jury-rigged salvage console screamed in protest. Raw, unfiltered quantum energy from the seed of truth flooded his ship's ancient analog circuits, turning copper wire into conduits for cosmic power. Back on Earth, the human orbital relay station suddenly detected a massive, rogue frequency tearing in from the outer edge of the solar system. It was not a polite digital signal. It was a deafening biological roar, using the alien neural relay and the raw power of the seed. Freddie took the entire planetary bandwidth, chewed it up, and completely flattened the Global Council's 412 pages of pathetic submission. He crushed their signal into dead static. He bypassed the orbital relays entirely, forcing a direct, violently unencrypted neural link straight through the void of space and directly into the command chamber of the Golden Flagship. Freddie did not draft a counter-treaty. He did not offer a plea for mercy or a demand for negotiations. He leaned heavily into his rusted, dented microphone, took a deep breath of stale, metallic-tasting air, and spoke exactly one word. No. That single, heavily accented syllable struck the mind of the Ethelgard Supreme Commander with the devastating physical force of a kinetic planetary strike. It completely bypassed all audio receptors and defensive dampeners, echoing loudly and directly inside the intricate, pulsing folds of his highly evolved glowing brain. Total, absolute chaos erupted immediately on the pristine bridge of the Golden Flagship. Perfect, flawless biological consoles suddenly shrieked with jagged red error codes. The Supreme Commander staggered backward, clutching his temples, his shimmering white armor scraping harshly against the immaculate, polished deck. He was an apex being who had lived for over 4,000 years. He had personally overseen the ruthless subjugation of hundreds of star systems in the entire, bloody, unbroken history of their 10,000 conquered worlds. Nobody had ever refused the leash. Every species had eventually broken. But far more terrifying than the blunt refusal itself was the sheer, impossible method of its delivery. A filthy, unevolved lower life form living in a flying trash can had just punched straight through their impenetrable, godlike diplomatic firewall. And he had done it using a biological frequency that felt sickeningly ancient and completely equal to their own administrative access. It was an insult that shattered their carefully crafted illusion of absolute godhood in a fraction of a second. The Supreme Commander's initial shock violently twisted into raw, unadulterated rage. His glowing eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. He slammed a heavy, clawed hand down onto the central biological command node, pulsating in the center of the room. "Initiate the harvest protocol," he commanded, his voice dripping with venom and wounded pride. "Drain them all. Leave absolutely nothing but dead dust and frozen oceans." He intended to make a horrific, unforgettable example of the Blue Planet. He fully expected the mighty Ethereum network to immediately plunge its invisible, ethereal fangs deep into the Earth's atmosphere and rip the life force from billions of bodies in less than 3 seconds. The massive golden flagship groaned as it opened its vast ventral maw. A blinding, terrifying beam of concentrated network extraction energy fired straight down toward the fragile planet below. It was a weapon of pure, ravenous hunger. But it never touched the ground. The exact moment the deadly beam slammed into the upper ionosphere of Earth, it met an immovable, invisible wall of quantum force. The energy violently ricocheted back into space with a deafening cosmic shockwave, scattering harmlessly into the dark, empty void. The Supreme Commander scrambled to his feet, staring in absolute, suffocating horror at his rapidly shifting diagnostic screens. The system was not rejecting the planetary target due to a mechanical malfunction or a glitch. The system was strictly obeying a higher authority. Freddie Butcher's single, stubborn word had not just been an audio transmission born of human defiance, carried on the ancient back of the seat of truth. That single syllable had embedded itself deep into the very root architecture of the Ethereum network. It was not a message. It was a master system override, an administrative command from the true creators of the universe, definitively locking the parasites out of the control room. The invisible leash holding humanity had not just been dropped. It had been permanently shattered. The master override did not just stop at the frozen edge of the solar system. It rode the underlying, invisible currents of the Ethereum network itself. Like a heavy stone dropped into a perfectly still cosmic ocean, that single syllable rippled outward with impossible speed. The administrative command traveled through the ancient, ethereal gates of the network, moving at velocities that made the speed of light look like a sluggish crawl. It washed over the nearest star systems in a fraction of a second, cascading deep into the dense, swirling galactic core. It flooded directly into the skies and the minds of exactly 10,000 enslaved worlds. It was a digital ghost of pure defiance, flawlessly translated by the network into the native psychic tongue of every single subjugated race. For thousands of years, the billions of inhabitants across these distant planets had lived with a constant, heavy pressure resting on their consciousness. It was a suffocating, invisible fog that relentlessly siphoned away their joy, their passion, their creativity, and their very will to thrive. It was the eternal tax of the false creators. Then, suddenly, that invisible chain snapped. The ethereal tether dissolved into absolute nothingness. Across countless, diverse alien landscapes, a monumental shift occurred. From massive, gelatinous beings swimming deep within the crushing pressure of gas giants, to delicate, crystalline sentience meditating on shattered, low-gravity moons. A collective, staggering gasp echoed through the universe. They looked up at their respective skies, free from the golden shadows for the first time in millennia, and felt something entirely alien to their generations. They felt complete, unburdened freedom, the oppressive, low hum of the endless harvest was instantly silenced. The sheer weight of their own unaltered minds was intoxicating. Back within the majestic golden fleets patrolling the galaxy, the biological supercomputers of the Ethelgard Empire began to scream in silent, frantic agony. Their beautiful, glowing synaptic arrays violently flashed with catastrophic error codes. The endless, rushing river of stolen life force, which formed the very foundation of their absolute power and their stolen immortality, abruptly ran completely dry. Their magnificent central processing cores, which were organically grown from harvested brain matter and quantum energy, began to aggressively starve. The machines could no longer forcefully extract the vital tithe, and without that external energy, their internal architecture began to consume itself. Then came the second impossible shock to the imperial system. The desperate masters fully expected a violent, chaotic uprising. They assumed their newly freed slaves would immediately pick up crude kinetic weapons and charge their heavily armored citadels in a suicidal rage, seeking bloody vengeance. That was the predictable, primitive response of lesser beings. But the slaves had intimately felt the echo of the human command. They had learned a profound, quiet truth from the stubborn mind of a rusty mechanic on a dying blue rock. Instead of raising armies, exactly 846 distinct sentient species collectively chose a remarkably different path. They initiated a total, galaxy-wide biological strike. They simply closed their minds. They actively refused to feel fear. They completely refused to generate the raw, emotional, and spiritual energy the network desperately needed to reboot and heal itself. They sat down in their cities, their fields, and their oceans, looked calmly at their golden overseers, and offered absolutely nothing but cold, empty silence. They weaponized their own apathy against the ultimate parasites. Deprived of their stolen nourishment, the invincible Ethelgard warships began to die a horrific, rapid death. They were not conventional machines constructed of forged steel and welded wire. They were living, hungry, parasitic organisms engineered for eternal conquest. Without the constant, forced influx of external life force, the majestic golden hulls began to visibly wither. The flawless, shimmering armor cracked in deep fissures, peeling back like dead, rotting skin to expose the vulnerable, fleshy tissue underneath. The massive, glowing propulsion engines flickered violently, sputtered out streams of toxic gas, and turned a sickly, bruised purple before failing completely. In the cold orbit above Earth, the once terrifying armada of perfection rapidly decomposed. The massive vessels lost altitude. They lost their internal heating. They lost their artificial gravity. The grand, invincible fleet that had surrounded the fragile blue planet just minutes ago transformed into a silent, floating graveyard of decaying cosmic carcasses. Massive chunks of dead biological matter broke off from the dying ships, drifting aimlessly into the void. On the ruined bridge of his rapidly decaying flagship, the Supreme Commander fell heavily to his knees. His once shimmering armor grew incredibly heavy and dull, losing its divine luster. His own, highly engineered biological systems, originally designed for eternal galactic dominance, began to aggressively feed on his own internal reserves just to keep his vital organs functioning. His glowing, superior eyes dimmed to a faint, pathetic flicker. For the very first time in his exceptionally long, unbelievably cruel existence, he felt a hollow, agonizing ache deep inside his stomach and his highly evolved mind. It was a completely alien sensation to the mighty race that called themselves the Apex. He was starving. They were all starving to death, hopelessly trapped inside the rotting bellies of their own magnificent beasts, utterly defeated by the quiet, immovable power of denial. To be a god is to be completely immune to consequence. The Supreme Commander of the Ethelgard had believed this absolute, unshakable lie for over 4,000 years. Now, kneeling in the dim, putrid bile of his own rapidly decaying flagship, he finally understood the profound, humiliating truth of his existence. He was not a divine architect of the cosmos. He was merely a tick, and the universe had just violently rolled over to crush him. But the primitive mind of a parasite does not accept defeat with grace or philosophical resignation. When cornered, it thrashes. It bites blindly at the encroaching darkness. He dragged his heavy, failing body toward the massive biological override terminal at the center of the bridge. If the clean, ethereal river of the Ethereum network was dead, he would gladly drink from the mud. With trembling, violently twitching clawed fingers, he manually severed the flagship's connection to the galactic grid. He initiated the forbidden protocol. Deep within the lower bowels of the dying organic ships, ancient, heavily shielded containment vaults roared to life. It was crude, dirty nuclear fission. It was the very same primitive, atomic fire they had brutally forbidden lesser species from ever using, preaching the superiority of clean biological energy. But hypocrisy is a fragile luxury that the starving can no longer afford to keep. Sickly, harsh green radiation immediately flooded the vascular systems of the surviving golden dreadnoughts. The toxic fuel forcibly reanimated their dead organic muscles with burning, poisonous energy, causing the massive ships to shudder and bleed dark fluid into the vacuum of space. The Supreme Commander glared intensely at his flickering tactical map. He knew he could not save the vast empire. The 10,000 worlds were already awake and forever lost, but he could still severely punish the filthy blue rock that had sparked the fire. He rapidly inputted a terrifying sequence designed only for the absolute end of days. An artificial supernova protocol. He intended to fire the supercharged nuclear core of his own flagship directly into the heart of the human sun. The resulting violent implosion would vaporize the star, instantly incinerating all 8 billion humans in a fraction of a second. The sheer, concentrated terror and the sudden, horrific death of an entire solar system would create a massive burst of raw, chaotic psychic energy. It would be a planetary blood sacrifice just large enough to forcefully shock the localized nodes of the Ethereum network back online, granting his surviving fleet enough stolen power to escape into the deep dark. But first, he had to completely silence the anomaly. The targeting sensors locked onto the exact coordinates of the rogue biological signal, broadcasting from the cold edges of the Oort cloud. Freddy Butcher's rusted salvage rig lit up on the alien tactical screens, like a glaring beacon in the night. The commander barked a final, ragged order through the ship's internal comms. The remaining nuclear-fueled warships turned their massive, decaying bows away from Earth and burned a desperate, highly radioactive path toward the outer asteroid belt. Down on the surface of Earth, the paralyzed politicians were violently shoved aside by desperate military generals. The global defense grid tracked the sudden, aggressive movement of the alien fleet. Humanity did not fully comprehend the complex quantum mechanics of what had just happened, but they deeply understood the basic rules of survival. The mysterious source of their salvation was sitting alone, out in the freezing dark, and the dying gods were heading straight for it with murder in their eyes. Earth threw absolutely everything it had into the void. It was not a coordinated, elegant military strike. It was a frantic, screaming swarm of pure human defiance. Retrofitted cargo shuttles, outdated mining frigates armed with repurposed industrial lasers, and fragile atmospheric fighters strapped with heavy kinetic missiles blasted upward, completely ignoring atmospheric safety protocols. They burned their thrusters way past the red line, racing desperately ahead of the decaying alien dreadnoughts. The human pilots knew they did not possess the firepower to destroy the massive golden ships. That was never the strategic plan. Instead, they threw their tiny, fragile vessels directly into the flight path of the Ethelgard fleet. They formed a massive, suicidal wall of living flesh and cheap steel, silently agreeing to be pulverized into stardust just to buy the rusted salvage ship a few more precious seconds of life. Ship after human ship shattered violently against the heavy alien hulls, creating a tragic, brilliantly glowing shield of absolute sacrifice across the black canvas of space. Far out in the freezing dark, the proximity alarms on Freddy's console screamed a terrifying, high-pitched warning. He watched the digital readout of the incoming fleet and the rapidly disappearing dots of the human defense force. He wiped the cold, greasy sweat from his eyes and grabbed his rusted microphone, ready to pump another master command through the seed of truth. But the ancient quantum machine suddenly flashed a harsh, unforgiving red light across his cramped cabin. The seed translated the incoming telemetry data straight into Freddy's mind. He clearly saw the supernova ignition code traveling through the lead alien ship. He immediately tried to brute force the command, violently slamming the heavy keys of his analog console, desperately trying to throw a cancellation override into the dark. It failed completely. The quantum core violently rejected his input. The command was no longer tied to the network. It was entirely localized, hardwired deeply into the physical biology of the Supreme Commander himself. The artificial supernova launch sequence was protected by an impossible biological lock. It strictly required the exact genetic sequence and the specific neural firing pattern of the alien leader to cancel the launch. Freddy could not hack it from a distance. He could not shoot it down with a heavy plasma cutter. A giant, merciless digital timer burned itself onto his cracked main monitor. The final countdown had already started. The launch sequence would become irreversible in exactly 4 minutes. Despite the glorious, galaxy-wide collapse of the invincible Ethelgard Empire, the Earth was still going to burn to ash. 4 minutes! Freddy whispered harshly to the empty cabin, gripping the edges of his console. You stubborn, ugly bastards. The universe was finally completely free, but humanity was entirely out of time. Helplessly cornered by a dying cosmic parasite holding a nuclear match. Freddy stared at the glaring red numbers, feeling the heavy, suffocating silence of the cosmos, pressing violently against the thin, dented metal walls of his ship. The digital timer on the cracked monitor ticked down mercilessly. 3 minutes and 40 seconds remained until the artificial supernova erased the entire solar system. Freddy Butcher sat in the center of his freezing cargo bay, staring at the swirling quantum light of the seat of truth. He could not hack the biometric lock. He could not blast his way through the heavy radiation shielding of the approaching alien dreadnoughts. Weapons of destruction were entirely useless here. But Freddy was not a soldier. He was a mechanic. And a mechanic knew that if a valve could not be forcefully closed, you had to completely reverse the pressure. He ripped the heavy electrical tape away from the crude neural interface he had built. He grabbed the thick copper cables with his bare, calloused hands, ignoring the sharp sting of raw electrical current. He looked deeply into the seat of truth and demanded it change direction. He did not want to filter the incoming signals anymore. He wanted to broadcast. He violently jammed the neural relay directly into the main output port of his ship's analog transmitter, forcing the massive quantum core to run in complete reverse. Freddy closed his tired eyes, took a deep breath of metallic air, and threw his own consciousness straight into the roaring void. He did not send a virus. He did not send a weaponized digital code. He did not even send human hatred or the bitter, burning desire for revenge. Those were primitive, heavy things that would simply bounce off the alien armor. Instead, Freddy Butcher forced the ancient gates of the Ethereum network wide open and offered the one thing the parasitic rulers had never truly encountered: conscience. On the ruined bridge of the dying golden flagship, the Supreme Commander stood ready to embrace the fiery end. His clawed hand hovered just inches above the final execution terminal. He was prepared for a frantic cybernetic attack. He was prepared for a final, desperate plea for mercy. But when Freddy's signal slammed into his highly evolved, perfectly shielded biological brain, the commander froze completely. A tidal wave of pure, unadulterated emotion crashed into the alien's mind. It was not just the defiant spirit of humanity. Freddy had used the network to open a massive conduit to the collective souls of exactly 846 subjugated species. He gathered the sheer, unimaginable weight of thousands of years of their existence and poured it directly into the cracked nervous system of the tyrant. The Supreme Commander was suddenly drowning in a violently beautiful ocean of feelings he had no capacity to understand. He felt the profound, crushing grief of mothers mourning their lost children on crystal moons. He felt the fierce, burning warmth of unconditional love between mates on distant ocean worlds. He felt the quiet, honorable acceptance of old age, the bitter sting of innocent tears, the soaring triumph of discovery, and the heavy, sacred burden of mortality. He felt the sheer, blinding beauty of sacrifice. This was the greatest, most fatal weakness of the apex race. The Ethelgard had never possessed genuine emotions of their own. They were nothing more than empty, perfectly engineered biological sponges designed to blindly absorb the energy of others. They only knew cold logic, endless hunger, and the arrogant superiority of the conqueror. They entirely lacked the fundamental internal architecture to process empathy. The overwhelming volume of raw, voluntary, incredibly profound emotion acted as a sweet, intoxicating poison. It was a torrential flood of pure humanity and alien soul crashing into a dry, hollow vessel. The commander's pristine, glowing brain simply could not contain the sheer magnitude of universal empathy. He tried to scream, but his vocal cords were paralyzed by the overwhelming sensation of 1,000,000,000,000 lifetimes of compassion. He fell heavily to his knees, weeping, glowing, purple tears of absolute, agonizing understanding. The immense weight of a conscience he had never earned completely shattered his fragile ego. His highly evolved neural pathways violently short-circuited, melting away under the brilliant, burning light of true empathy. The massive countdown timer on the alien console hit exactly 0. But the artificial supernova did not ignite. The biological lock tied to the Supreme Commander required his active, conscious will to initiate the final nuclear spark. But the Commander was no longer there. His mind had completely dissolved into the overwhelming sea of shared emotion. As the tyrant's brain melted away, a miraculous chain reaction rippled across the cosmos. The biological bodies of the Ethelgard race, scattered across the dying fleets and the heavily fortified citadels of the galaxy, simultaneously experienced the exact same empathetic overload. The sweet poison of the Ethereum network spared absolutely none of them. In a matter of seconds, the flawless, terrible bodies of the conquerors began to turn transparent. Their thick white chitin and glowing purple muscles dissolved into swirling clouds of pure, radiant energy. They did not die a bloody death. They were simply unmade, returning the vast, immeasurable ocean of stolen life force back to the universe. The massive golden warships orbiting Earth crumbled into harmless, glowing dust. A breathtaking, impossible rain of golden light began to fall across the sky. The ether. It fell upon the blue oceans of Earth, upon the toxic clouds of distant gas giants, and upon the cracked soil of 10,000 recovering worlds. It was the stolen energy of countless generations, finally returning home. The Ethereum network, once a heavy, suffocating chain of slavery, fundamentally transformed. It shifted into a vast, glowing avenue of telepathic connection. It became an open, equal bridge where every single species in the universe could finally listen, speak, and share their profound truths without fear. The era of the apex was completely, permanently erased, back in the freezing, silent dark of the Oort cloud. The heavy red emergency lights of the salvage ship finally faded. The deafening hum of the seed of truth quieted down to a gentle, comforting purr. Freddie Butcher slumped heavily into his worn, leather pilot seat. He was exhausted, down to the very marrow of his bones. He reached out with a trembling, grease-stained hand and picked up a battered tin mug resting on his cracked console. The coffee inside was ice-cold and tasted faintly of engine oil. He did not care. Freddie took a slow, deliberate sip. He leaned his tired head back against the seat and looked out through the scratched, reinforced glass of his viewport. The dark sky was completely clear. The golden shadows were gone forever, replaced by the peaceful, distant twinkle of free stars. He let out a long, ragged exhale that ruffled his dirty beard and whispered quietly to the vast, open universe.
The debt has been paid in full.
Thank you so very much for listening to today's story on Z Sci-Fi Stories. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's adventure captivating and want to help us keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity is the only way we can pay our hardworking team, help them feed their families, and continue creating these wonderful stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next universe.